I'm here to give you some perspective. If you think your startup is crashing and burning, things are falling apart, you're running out of money and you're out of runway and you're desperate and you think you're a big fat failure, what is going on? What should I do? I talk to founders all the time that think they're in that situation. And so, again, I want to give you a little bit of perspective. Let's talk about Runway, and that is how long you have before your startup runs out of money. And as Will and Ryan at startups.com on the Startup Therapy podcast always say, it's not that your startup runs out of money, founders run out of money. And you might be in a situation where have to go get a job, or I'm going to go need to sell my car, or I can't pay the rent or anything like that. I understand, been in that situation before. Let's talk about the reasons we get into this situation, what to do, and the perspectives you might want to have. First of all, understand that you could be in the opposite situation. What's the opposite situation? Founders get into this all the time where if you have access to too much capital. I had a business mentor once tell me, a very wealthy and successful business mentor once tell me, Ed, access to too much capital leads to undisciplined decisions. How does this apply to founders? I've been in situations and I've seen situations where there's plenty of capital and people are not working with the same urgency and the intensity required to build the startup because there's cash in the bank. We know the paychecks are going to come, the bills are going to get paid. So there's no fire to light under our feet, or fires that are burning under our feet, or our proverbial asses, if you will, to motivate us to work quickly, work fast, make decisive decisions. I've also seen founders with plenty of capital in the bank. We're talking like $500,000, $1 million, and they're sitting pretty and they say, well, we got 12 months of runway. And so decision making goes really slow. They're not decisive in pushing forward because they say, we've got runway to at least figure it out. And that can also be a detriment. And I think often you'd rather be in a situation where you're desperate and you're out of that runway and you're having to make decisions quickly to come to a conclusion on your startup versus you're sitting on investor money and you're not doing everything you can with it, and you're getting a little comfortable, or you have a sense of false security that you've got time to figure things out and you don't. I've seen founders whittle their capital all the way down to like 6 months, and then that fire starts to burn and they start really moving forward. And you look at them and you think to yourself, geez, what changed, right? You seem so much more decisive. You're exploring all the things. No stone is unturned. And you're thinking to yourself, well, this is the reason investors give money in tranches. And you want to be really careful on how you're managing your capital, but at the same time, the intensity in which you're executing. So that a founder gets to 6 months and they're pushing and they're pushing and pushing, and then everything's on the table, and now they're really thinking with an open mind. They're trying all these things. They're getting people together. There's lots of energy, and you come to a conclusion one way or the other. And sometimes I think to myself, I'd rather have a bullet between the eyes than 2 in the chest or 3 in the chest over time and bleed out slowly. Coming to a quick conclusion on whether you're validating or invalidating your investment thesis and your assumptions on what you're doing with your capital, I think can be a benefit. So what do we do here? Well, first is you want to calculate the runway. All right. So really be clear on calculating the runway and figure out, okay, how much time do I actually have? Many times founders, they get all this in their minds and their perceptions or their emotions become their reality. And they realize that they've got more runway than they thought, or they've got less runway than they thought. And once you start putting down those numbers, you can be accountable to those numbers. You want to calculate that runway. The next is you want to make some hard decisions in terms of budgeting. So start planning your budget properly. I met with a founder yesterday, and he said, Ed, we got our runway down from $80,000 a month to $40,000 a month with the capital that we got left over and the sales that are potentially coming in. We could actually get to break even, which is default alive, by the end of this year. And that's the story we're going to be telling our investors. Or they say, if we had this amount of money, we'd get to default alive because now we can invest in these things. And therefore, our capital requirements have gone out. We're raising less money to make the capital raise a little easier. So you want to start doing some budgeting, and that's the key. And then the final thing is, and it seems reductive, and if you have me as your advisor, it's easy: traction, traction, traction. So what you're doing is you're going to set those goals, and you're going to figure out, okay, for us to get there, let's plan out what type of sales. So we've reduced it. How much business do we need? How many more users? What do we need to do to get that amount of money in the bank? And I remember listening to Michael Seibel when it came to Twitch, and they were just burning a ton of money. And they had this meeting, and they said something like, we need to come up with something gaudy, like $250,000 a month in extra revenue per month, after they looked at their revenue and they calculated their runway and they figured out what their budget is. And they said, we are not leaving this room until we get $250,000 a month in extra revenue, or what was it? Maybe $25,000. I'm not sure. But out of that, the innovations came that they started adding, different advertising, things they never thought about before, because that fire was lit and everything was on the table. Again, don't quote me on the numbers. The principles are there. And that's been a really interesting exercise. I just went through this with one of our portfolio companies where the investors came in and said, we're looking at the financials. It's really ugly. If you do not make decisions based on this, and that by this time, we're pulling the plug on you. And that galvanized the CEO. And he sent me a message the other day, and he said, Ed, our team is way smaller, our expenses are down, but we're so much more effective. And he was feeling a lot more confident, secure. Well, everybody gets together and says, okay, what are the traction goals we need to hit? And we are not leaving this room till we got figured out, or every week we're reporting on traction, 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 and you set a goal. One of the things that they taught us at Y Combinator and to prep for the grind is, I remember listening to an interview, and they said, take a little sticky note and put it on your computer, and it's 10% week over week growth. And do everything you can to grow 10% week over week from the previous week, because that's going to lead to the exponential growth. And if you're not hitting the 10%, so this is what I would do. By the end of the week, I would calculate and say, if I'm not hitting 10%, say I hit 8%, I ask myself why. And we have a team meeting and say, what do we need to do differently? Ask these questions. Here's what happens. I ask, what do we need to start, stop, and continue doing? It's simple. And it's a lot of founders or team members that kind of roll their eyes. But if you hold everybody accountable and you say, what do we need to start, stop, and continue doing to reach that 10% or reach that amount, then you can analyze the reason you're not getting there and do that week over week and go in an iterative cycle. So what are we going to try? How do we measure it? And what do we learn? Try, measure, learn. Try, measure, learn. And you go in these tight iterative cycles. And what's great is when you're desperate and you don't have runway and the resources are aplenty and you're not sitting there in an undisciplined state, those iterative cycles become so much tighter and so much more disciplined that you are accelerating. And that's the key to it. Get into some tighter cycles and figure out some key wins and literally go week to week, or then you can decide this isn't going to work whatsoever, and you get there a lot faster. And if you have capital, you can return it, or you can pivot, or different things like that. So that's how you work through. If you're in this situation where, oh my gosh, what do I do? Break it down, work it in little chunks. Let me give you a little brain science theory in terms of a locus of control and how your brain works. If you can focus on a short-term goal and your brain energy, the cognitive load, you reduce it, and your energy is not going to all the scary things, as Will and Ryan talk about in the Startup Therapy podcast. Highly recommend you check it out if you haven't. Talking about those paper demons, the things that are really scary, but they're just in our minds and they're not even relevant in the moment. If you can get your mind off that and just focus on what is the next thing that I need to do? What is the next call? What do I have to do tomorrow? What is the next piece of content? And you can focus on that. Your brain actually goes and into this mode where the short-term learning centers, the performance centers of your brain become optimized, where you can just focus on something really tight. If you read the book called The Happiness Advantage by Sean Achor, he calls this the Zorro Circle. In other words, referencing another author talking about Stephen Covey, and he says there's the circle of concern and then there's the circle of influence or control. Well, it's the same principle. If you can tighten that up and say, what do I need to do next? It's the Zorro Circle, which goes to the whole Zorro movie, etc. But it just implies that I'm going to focus on what I have control over in the here and now, stay intentional, and then my brain power is not getting sucked into stuff I can't control or stuff I don't have influence over. Go micro and say, what am I going to do next? Forget about, I need to go raise $2 million to save this company. No. What is the next thing? So what is the next phone call you're going to make? What is the next email? What is the next list of 10 contacts that you're going to make? And go into these tight iterative circles. So just make those 10 phone calls, try it, measure the response, and learn. Try, measure, learn, try, measure, learn. And after you figure out what you learn, you say, what should I start doing, stop doing, and continue doing that works? And be brutal, be scientific about it, and figure out where to go from there. That's the best way to do it. And if you do it right, your startup's either going to tank and fold, and then at least you know you can move on with your life and you can stop paying the cost of opportunity. You're moving on. And that is a gift. Let me tell you, that's a gift. Or you've developed the discipline and you figured out that when you do have capital, you're not going to end up in those situations again. And you've learned quicker, and it's actually cheaper to fail when you don't have all this capital than if you're sitting on $500,000, $250,000, $1 million from investors, and you're making all these bum decisions until it's too late. A lot more difficult to work yourself out of a hole after you've burned $500,000 in capital versus I only have $20,000 and I'm going to shut down in the next 2 months if I don't get this figured out. There are lots of benefits, and that's what investors are looking at. And your co-founders and the future employees, and you're going to serve yourself so much better as a leader of your startup later on if you follow these steps. Keep calm, start up on, and if you need help, office hours are available to you, all your advisors. Thanks for being part of the community. Look forward to talking to you in the next office hours video.